There is a star at the center of the Japanese sky that does not move. Every other star traces an arc across the night, rising in the east, falling in the west, obedient to the same turning that governs the sun and the moon and the slow procession of the seasons. But the pole star holds. It does not rise. It does not set. It simply burns at the axis of the world, fixed and cold and utterly indifferent to everything that rotates beneath it. The people who lived on the Japanese archipelago before the Yamato court systematized their beliefs. Before the gods were given genealogies and temples and political appointments, those people looked at that unmoving star and understood it as something other. Not divine in the way the sun is divine, warm and life-giving, and obviously necessary. Divine in the way of a nail driven through the sky. A presence that holds the cosmos in place by refusing to participate in it. They called that presence Amatsu-Mikaboshi, August Star of Heaven. What we know about the pre-Yamato religious landscape is fragmentary by design. The Nihon Shoki, Japan's second oldest chronicle, was compiled in 720 CE under direct imperial patronage, roughly 2,000 years after Rome's founding, for those who need a landmark. The Kojiki preceded it by 8 years. Both texts were official projects, commissioned by a court that had specific theological and political work for mythology to do. What existed before those compilations can only be reconstructed from what the text couldn't quite suppress: the odd passage that contradicts the official cosmology, the deity whose name survives but whose stories don't, the ritual whose meaning had already become obscure by the time anyone wrote it down. Amatsu-Mikaboshi belongs to this residue. He appears in the Nihon Shoki in exactly one passage. Then the record goes silent. But that silence is instructive, because it tells us what the compilers were willing to acknowledge existed, even as they were in the process of erasing it. The Shinto cosmological system, as the Nihon Shoki presents it, is fundamentally one of ordered emergence. In the beginning, heaven and earth separate from primordial chaos. The first deities arise in sequence, each generation more defined than the last. The system culminates in Amaterasu, the sun goddess, whose descendants become the imperial line. It is a cosmology built to justify a specific political arrangement: divine rule, continuous lineage, heavenly man. Into this orderly account of divine succession, Amatsu-Mikaboshi does not fit. He predates the genealogy. He holds no place in the succession of generations. He is simply there, at the pole, before the ordering began, and when the ordering comes for him, he refuses it. The passage in the Nihon Shoki is brief enough to quote almost in full. After the god Futsunushi and the thunder deity Take-Mikazuchi have pacified the land of Ashihara no Nakatsukuni, the middle country, the earth, on behalf of the heavenly court, one power remains unsubdued. The text calls him Ama-no-Kagaseo, brilliant male of heaven, which appears to be either another name for Amatsu-Mikaboshi or a title he bore in this context. The exact identification has. What the text says is this: he alone had not yet been brought to submission. Futsunushi and Take-Mikazuchi were sent to him. He refused. They pressed him. He refused again. Only after sustained divine compulsion did he finally yield and become, in the text's careful phrasing, obedient. Then the text moves on and never mentions him again. Read that sequence slowly, because there is a great deal happening in very few words. First, the compilers knew about him. This was not a tradition they were unaware of. They had enough information to name him, to describe his location, to assign specific gods to the task of subduing him. Second, he was powerful enough that the heavenly court could not simply ignore or absorb him. He required two of the most formidable divine enforcers in the pantheon. Third, he refused. This is a deity with a will that resisted the imperial theological project. And the text records that resistance even as it insists on his eventual capitulation. What happened to him after that capitulation? Nothing. No temple, no shrine, no ritual, no role in the cosmic order. He does not appear in the Kojiki at all. He does not receive a place in the divine bureaucracy that organizes the rest of the Shinto pantheon. The gods who submitted and cooperated became pillars of a system that is still practiced today. Amatsu-Mikaboshi, who submitted under compulsion, was simply removed from the account. The erasure was not careless. It required effort. Whoever compiled the Nihon Shoki had to decide what to do with a deity who was clearly known, clearly important to someone, clearly resistant, and they made a specific choice. They recorded the minimum necessary to acknowledge his existence, demonstrated his defeat, and then closed the file. The minimum necessary. Think about what that means. They needed him to be defeated on the record. His defeat required witnesses. His existence was, in some sense, still alive enough in 720 CE that it had to be formally addressed, formally subdued, formally archived. You do not go to the trouble of officially defeating something no one believes in anymore. Which means that in the early 8th century, when the imperial court was consolidating its theological authority over a diverse and fractured religious landscape, Amatsu-Mikaboshi was still present enough in popular or regional belief that he needed to be subordinated in the written record. Not destroyed, subordinated, because destroying him would have required explaining him at length, and explanation grants significance. Better to give him a single paragraph, note his defeat. The consequence of that strategy was not erasure, it was transformation. If the Nihon Shoki tried to archive Amatsu-Mikaboshi, the medieval religious imagination did something far stranger with him. It gave him an empire. Buddhism arrived in Japan officially in the 6th century CE, though its actual diffusion into the culture was gradual and contested across the following centuries. By the Heian period, roughly contemporary with the height of the Carolingian successor states in Europe, Esoteric Buddhism had developed a complex and highly populated cosmology of its own, filled with wrathful deities, protective demons, and vast hierarchies of supernatural beings that the institutional. Into this system, Amatsu-Mikaboshi was reintroduced, not as a subdued provincial deity, not as a footnote in an imperial chronicle. He entered esoteric Buddhism as Ama-no-Kagaseo, commander of demons, a figure of genuine cosmic malevolence. The refusal that the Nihon Shoki had tried to contain became, in this new context, a defining characteristic. He was the one who would not submit. He was the one who stood apart from the divine order. And in a Buddhist cosmological framework that needed adversarial figures to occupy specific roles, tempters, corruptors, lords of disorder, his refusal was exactly what made him useful. The demonic court he came to command in medieval imagination was substantial. He was depicted in certain esoteric traditions as presiding over entities associated with misfortune, spiritual pollution, and the corruption of the living world. His iconography in this period where it survives draws on the fearful imagery of wrathful deities, not the contained fury of a protective demon, but something older and less domesticated. The star that does not move, reimagined. There is a particular quality to how Japanese religious tradition handles dangerous supernatural forces that is worth dwelling on here. The category of tatari, divine punishment or curse, the wrath of spirits insufficiently honored, runs through Shinto practice with a distinctive logic. Powerful beings who are ignored, displaced, or insufficiently propitiated do not simply fade. They become dangerous in proportion to their neglect. The larger the presence, the greater the danger. By that logic, Amatsu-Mikaboshi was a disaster waiting to unfold. He had not merely been neglected. He had been formally defeated, stripped of his place in the divine order, and then systematically written out of the record. If tatari accumulates from ordinary neglect, what accumulates from a deliberate and comprehensive erasure of a deity who predated the entire official pantheon? The medieval imagination's answer was Ama-no-Kagaseo, brilliant male of heaven, lord of the demons, the god who refused, who was subdued but could not be made to cooperate, ruling from outside the system that had tried to expunge him. The pole star still does not move, everything else orbits it. The center holds, but the center is cold. What is notable about his role in esoteric Buddhism is that it is not entirely adversarial in the simple sense. He is not Japan's Satan, a figure of rebellion against a loving order. The framework is more oblique than that. He represents something more like the principle of refusal itself, the force that exists prior to organization and does not recognize the authority of what came after. That is a more unsettling concept than mere evil, because it does not submit. A principle of prior existence that simply does not acknowledge the categories of the system trying to defeat it is something else entirely. This is why, in the traditions that developed around him, the recommended response to Ama-no-Kagaseo was rarely direct confrontation. It was appeasement, avoidance, or the careful management of exposure. You do not defeat what predates defeat. You navigate around it. Modern Shinto scholarship has returned to Amatsu-Mikaboshi with a specific and uncomfortable question. What religious tradition did he originally belong to? The pole star cult is not unique to Japan. Across East Asia and into Central Asia, the fixed star at the celestial axis was the object of significant religious attention in the centuries before and during the Common Era. In Chinese tradition, the pole star held a position of profound cosmological importance. It was the axis mundi, the point around which the heavens turned, associated with imperial authority and with the primordial organizing force of the cosmos. Goods moved, ideas moved, religious forms moved. What some scholars now argue is that Amatsu-Mikaboshi represents the trace of a pole star cult that was indigenous to or early established in the Japanese archipelago, a religious tradition rooted in star observation and celestial axis worship that predated the consolidation of Shinto as an organized system under Yamato imperial authority. When the Yamato court built its theological framework around Amaterasu and the solar lineage, a competing tradition, simply other, and therefore a political problem. A single passage in the Nihon Shoki on this reading is not a mythological remnant. It is a record of religious suppression. The story of two divine enforcers compelling a holdout deity into submission is the story of a new theological order making room for itself by formally subordinating what came before. The fact that Amatsu-Mikaboshi refused twice before capitulating may reflect an actual historical resistance, communities or priesthoods that maintained. This is speculative. The evidence is thin precisely because the erasure was thorough. But the question the scholarship keeps circling is the same question the Nihon Shoki inadvertently raised and tried to close. What was there before? The gods who are remembered are the gods who won. The Shinto pantheon that is practiced today, the shrines, the rituals, the solar theology of imperial legitimacy, is the theology of a specific political victory in the early 8th century. It is a living tradition with genuine depth and meaning. It is also, inescapably, a tradition that was constructed at a particular moment for particular purposes, and that construction required decisions about what to include and what to close. Amatsu-Mikaboshi is what the file couldn't quite contain. He was too old, too fixed. The star at the center of the sky that does not move, does not cooperate with the turning of the heavens. You can build a cosmology that ignores it, but you cannot make it move. You cannot make it disappear. You can record its defeat in a single paragraph of an official chronicle in 720 CE, then never mention it again, then watch it reappear 6 centuries later commanding a court of demons in a foreign religion's cosmology. The gods who write the myths decide what gets remembered. But the thing about a nail driven through the sky is that it holds whether you acknowledge it or not. Long after the chronicle was sealed and the official theology was settled and the shrines were built to different powers entirely, the pole star kept burning at the axis of the world. Cold, unmoving. Still there,